The danger of being successful is that you think you're smart. To be successful, you have to be lucky in part. That's just a fact to me. And you have to also not only have a great idea, you have to time it right and you have to execute it right. And those three things are tough to do alone.
Gary, thank you so much for your time. Really excited to be delving into your book, Pivot or Die. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up becoming the president and CEO of CTA.
Well, sheer luck, like a lot of things in life. You make decisions in life that are important. That's what the book is about. But some of them are not that important. They just help you go on a path that you would never have envisioned. And I started out like ending up in Washington for law school at the last second, and I was broke and I needed a job, and I got one on Capitol Hill for the money. It wasn't a great strategy. It turns out it was a great strategy, and that job got me to a law firm job while I was in school, also needing money, and the client was actually the association. And as a second-year law student, I started working for them, and I kept with the firm after law school as an associate, and I ended up almost working full-time for this client who was smart enough to say, we could pay you a fraction of your salary rather than what we're paying the law firm. You could do the same stuff. But that got me in a position where there was a major lawsuit wending its way through the courts, which threatened the legality of important technology, which was the VCR at the time. And I ended up chairing and heading an effort at the age of 25, 26, with all these people who became famous, like David Rubenstein, who started the Carlyle Group, and Ron Brown, who became Secretary of Commerce. And I was running the meetings they were all in, of about 20 or 30 lawyers and lobbyists. And we were the young upstarts. And we were up against the established Washington, the motion picture industry and the music industry. And we were just, honestly, we were more diverse, we were smarter and more strategic, and we were hungry. And we didn't realize how little chance we had of winning, which got us to win. And we beat them at every level step, including the Supreme Court, including in Congress, and that allowed video rentals, which created a whole new market. And also allowed the VCR to expand. It allowed audio recording to go. It helped get out the iPhone as well as all sorts of recording devices, and preserve the legality of the internet, which was also being challenged. It's hard to believe, but people were arguing it should be illegal. They were saying it's the biggest copying device in the world. But the Supreme Court actually held that you could use these devices because they have a lot of great uses for society. But it was only a 5-4 decision. And that was the very important decision for technology. But we're still fighting those same battles, believe it or not. As new technology is coming, whether it's artificial intelligence or self-driving cars, we're always fighting someone whose status quo is being affected. And if you think about how the media world has been affected by all these new technologies, broadcasters were making money from advertising, reaching broad audiences, but in reality, most of the advertising has to be targeted. And the internet and other social media, all these things that have come along, have changed that, and our association represents all the new guys, all the technology that's new, whether it's the big companies and the software platforms and others, the Googles and the Microsofts and the Apples. We want to see the U.S. top of the world in innovation. We're not going to own everything, but we have so much going our way, whether it's all the people we attract from around the world that are smart, the immigrants who are really overly represented in all these tech companies, or most of the tech companies, and starting them, or their first generation. We're just hungry here, and we're diverse, which really makes us actually more innovative. And it's a good thing. I mean, it does cause us to fight a lot of our stuff among ourselves, but we learn how to disagree for the most part.
Right. So for those that might not know about CTA, tell us about the mission and the vision of what you guys do at your organization.
Well, sure. We're a nonprofit association. We're composed of 1,300 companies that have a part of being a technology company. A lot of them you wouldn't even expect. I mean, there's financial firms, there's other firms. They just want to be part of what we do because we're so focused on the future. I mean, we even have a deal with NASDAQ running over 20 different indices they do in developing areas like cloud computing, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, gaming, things like that. And we focus on the new things to make sure that they can be legal. That doesn't mean we're opposed to government at all. We like knowing what's legal and knowing what's illegal. In fact, we think the role of government is to tell us that in part, so that you can invest in something and not have uncertainty and then lawsuits and delay and you're wasting money. And in the technology world, that's really important. But every company, I've been saying this for 20 years from the CES stage, every company has to be a technology company. You can't do things, even in more commodity-driven businesses, where without partnering with other people to get what you need, or to have technology help you market, or to do all sorts of other things.
Right. So the main reason for the interview today is about your new book, Pivot or Die. So tell us a little bit about
This
There
book?
you go. There you go. Pivot or Die. The title. I wanted to ask you about the title. So at first glance, it is a very bold title. Some might say even startling title. What's the story behind the actual title of the book? And was that intentional?
Well, it better be intentional because it's on the cover. It was someone's intent, certainly our publishers. For years from the CES stage, I've been saying innovate or die, for decades actually, because you have to change, because the world changes quickly, and if you don't change with it,
right,
you're going to lose. I mean, we're humans. Humans like to take a picture of the world and preserve the status quo. From childhood, when we have our parents and they're young and healthy, for our friends, and then people around us start dying, and that's just the reality of life. Things change and you have to adjust. Same thing in the business world. If you just think you're going to preserve what every revenue product has made you strong and the world's not going to change, you're going to lose. So you have to be paranoid and you have to adjust to changes. And the reason the pivot came is that, to me, COVID was such a global pivot. I mean, I don't think human beings, at least in our generation or our lifetime, have experienced such a shift in direction as what we experienced with COVID. We all had to change what we were doing, no matter what we believed or where we even lived in the world. And that's what the book in part centers and starts with COVID and how it happened and how we responded. I personally, with my family, with my wife coming home in January saying this is the biggest deal in our lifetime. And we just changed immediately. We did it with our trade show. We canceled the physical one 7 months earlier, and a lot of my colleagues were upset with me, like, how could you do that? It could be cured by that. It's not going to be cured by that. And to everything we did, to how we cut back and what we did, and even the investments we made, frankly.
In one of the chapters, you talk about some legacy companies like the Coca-Colas of the world, like Samsung, that started their companies 50, 60 years ago, and they're in a completely different industry today than when they first started. So tell us a little bit about, what's the commonality with these mega companies that have been able to pivot over the years, over the decades? What's the one common thread that allowed these companies to succeed when others were not able to succeed?
Coca-Cola is a great example, because think about it, all the different product lines they have now, how they went global, how they do their distribution, how they even sell it in different distribution channels, and how they went to Diet Coke. Right. And then there was a product called New Coke, which there was another pivot there, because people didn't really love how it was substituting for other Cokes. Right. And think of all the pivots they've made. And they've adjusted each time. And that product is now, whatever, 100 years old or so, their basic product. But they have so many other brands and so many other products. And the thing is, you got to change, because your competitors are out there and they're going to change. And until COVID, I felt that, especially in my world of technology, a lot of the biggest brands would always look at each other and go along with a group. And sometimes it was just sheer frustrating. I think I've written in prior books, and maybe a little bit in this one, about 3D television, which drove me. I offered to quit my job rather than promote 3D television, because I thought it was such a loser, and I refused to promote it. But other companies, and I didn't understand it, but they were following each other, and especially in the Japanese culture, like the word no doesn't even exist. So they go along with what the boss says, and the boss goes, it's like a consensus without really discussion culture. Right. And that's not healthy for introducing a lot of products. So it depends what the product is. I mean, you have to have some sense of the marketplace and what consumers want.
The leadership at these companies, they had a continuous innovation or pivoting cycle, right? So it was part of the culture. And so they were able to maneuver, at a time when others, maybe their competitors weren't able, they weren't on the same page. So there was a continuous drive for innovation, and that's what really helped them to, pivot or move to different directions where the market or the industry is headed. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, you have to have an innovation mindset. One of the things I've seen in common that leaders have that are successful is they actually listen more than they speak, and they ask a lot of good questions, and they're naturally curious. Yeah. And they're always asking questions. They always want to learn more, and they're always ready for a new idea, and they're not closed. I mean, there are probably some leaders that are closed off to the world, but even if you look at some really unusual people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, or dare I say it, Donald Trump, they're leaders which actually, they have strong opinions. They also are not as affected. They don't have the same level of perhaps emotional intelligence or this ability to be shamed by what some of the things they say. On the other hand, they're actually very good listeners. They ask a lot of questions. And they actually make decisions. You may think they're just like brilliant and coming off the top of their heads, all three of them, but it's a long way to get to where they are, and they dig in on the facts, and they explore and they see where but those are just three. I mean, they're extremes because they're so famous and popular and successful, at least as they define it in different ways. But a lot of others, and there's thousands of others that I've probably met in my career, where they do share that. But there are a few that are like isolate themselves in the world, and they're usually one-hit wonders if you want to know the truth. They've created a company based on sheer luck, they've sold it, and then they've had a lot of failures because they think they're so bright. The danger of being successful is that you think you're smart, and to be successful, you have to be lucky in part. That's just a fact to me. It's my belief, I guess. And you have to also not only have a great idea, you have to time it right, and you have to execute it right. And those three things are tough to do alone.
In the book, you talk about 4 different types of pivots: the startup pivot, the forced pivot, the success pivot, and the failure pivot. So, can you define each of what they mean and provide an example of what those, what really exemplifies those types of pivots?
Sure. So the startup pivot is, people say, I'm a startup, how can I compete with these big guys? Well, the little secret is startups can compete more easily because they can move quicker than any big company. Startups could have an idea that's totally out of the box. They don't have to go through 5 levels and committees and all this other stuff. So you could create things which are just amazing. My reason for optimism in part in the future is that we've lost a lot of investment capital because startups weren't being funded as much as they were in the past because there was no exit by going to a big company. You had to rely on going public or through private equity. Which David Rubenstein, my friend, when I talked about it, he said, don't forget private equity, it's really important. So that's, but the bottom line of it is that startups have some amazing advantages, and they could just keep pivoting. And when they come to CES, what I always tell them is, look, you'll have 4 days, you're going to see literally over 1,000 people, and they're going to react. A lot of them are potential customers. You don't have to have a great business plan. You don't have to have a long strategic plan. You don't even have to have a working prototype. You just have to have an idea and some semblance, and then listen and get the feedback. And your business plan is going to change, and your idea of your product is, or your service, will change by the end of the show, most likely.
There's one quote I really liked about the startup pivot, and I'll quote the sentence. You say, sometimes newness itself is the advantage. New companies aren't bound by the expected or the ingrained way of doing things that bigger, more established organizations so often are. And I think that point is so critical, is when you're a startup, you're forced, you're not bound by dogma. You don't have the higher ups telling you what you can, what you can't do. So you have a blank canvas, and you're able to execute without the hindrances. You mentioned Jamie Siminoff of Doorbot that eventually went converted into Ring. I think that was
so he didn't get funding on Shark Tank.
Right. Yeah. And eventually he as you said in the book, he did a partnership with Foxconn, and from there that's when the product really took off.
He's and it is true though. I mean, obviously not everyone should invest in every startup, but startups move so quickly. On the other hand, it's your money when as a startup or your angel investors. And you have to keep getting funding because it's difficult to make money off the bat doing anything. Now, and it's clearly the internet and that technology, you actually can, because what do you need to be an entrepreneur around the globe today? You just need, a computer and a broadband connection, and all of a sudden you can start businesses. It's a phenomenal time to be alive and being in business right now.
So Gary, let's move on to the success pivot. Explain what that is, and maybe share an example of what the success pivot, how it manifests.
Well, the success pivot is where you're really doing well, you're super confident, but if you either have the humility or the paranoia or the intelligence to say, wait a second, things change. This is a time when I can invest the time and the money into something even better, which is like diversifying your assets. That's the time to do it. So my best example is certainly Amazon and Jeff Bezos, where he started out with being the #1 online bookseller. He did it right away and owned the market. And when he came to our meeting of executives and he brought this little device, we had no idea what he was talking about or doing. And honestly, I thought he was crazy. Like the Kindle, to something that people could hold when they, out of fairness, I'd given a speech 10 years earlier saying these products will never succeed because who wants to read a book electronically? I mean, it's tough on the eyes and you get bored. But he actually made it work.
Right.
And he recognized you could change the font, you could do all sorts of things, and he kept that. But meanwhile, he also expanded his book business to go to all other categories. And then he went to cloud computing, which still is the most profitable part of his company.
Right.
And then he personally went to grocery stores and newspapers and things like that. So he is a great example of a success pivot.
I would imagine like there are a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and many of them are food and beverage companies. The leadership has kind of rose through the ranks because of the success of one or two products. I would imagine that it would be difficult for someone in that position to have the mindset of a success pivot. Is that fair? Is that a fair statement? I wanted to get your opinion. Is it more difficult to find like a Jeff Bezos type at that size of company that has already experienced tremendous success on one or two products and then having to think about a new avenue of growth?
That's a great question. I would say that the advantage of hiring someone who has failed is so great
right.
that no one bats 1,000 in professional baseball, and no one does 1,000 in business. I mean, that's why it's a very good interview question to ask people. Tell me about something that didn't work out and how you handled it and what you did. And if someone says, the only thing that didn't work out is, I only put like 80 hours in rather than 90, or 90 rather than 80, or whatever, or I couldn't sleep one night because I worked too hard. That's a standard BS reply that you just have. So, before you go for the top job, people have to be able to willing to admit their failures.
Yeah.
And I've never met anyone in business who has actually refused to admit a failure once you really spoke to them.
Right.
Something you could have done better in your own career or life.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's a great segue to the last pivot, the failure pivot. Talk to us a little bit about what that is, what that looks like.
Well, the failure pivot is a pivot where you really have failed, and you might be going under, and it's more of a Hail Mary pass. But you can view it as desperation, or you can view it as an opportunity to do something very different. Yeah. You know you're on a trend and it's not going to work. You have to have the courage to say, I failed, it's not going to work, and then pivot to something else. And that happens all the time with startups. I mean, having invested in a number of startups myself, let me tell you, there's a lot of failure pivots, and some of them are just crazy. But PayPal was one which started out, it wasn't working out well, and the founder just totally shifted to, and some of it is as simple as renaming and repositioning. Yeah. The market that you thought was there isn't there. Yeah. But you look at what are your core assets and what else they can do. And a lot of companies have had failure pivots. Yeah. They're just successful now. A lot of companies had failure pivots and they continue to fail.
Right. Yeah, you brought up a great example, PayPal. So Max Levchin, you put in the book that he failed 4 times before he started PayPal. So, to have that sort of resilience to failure after failure, but not giving up and, finally coming upon a product or a service that actually makes it big.
Well, think about it actually. A number of people have been in bankruptcy and then they succeeded. The guy who created the Venetian Hotel, Sheldon Adelson, he had several businesses until he created a successful trade show, 𝗂𝗏, which he sold, and then built the Venetian, and he built his entire empire, so he's one of the wealthiest people in the country after a number of failures. The incoming president of the United States has had bankruptcy a few times. Right. And bankruptcy is an admitted failure. The beauty of the U.S. system is it allows you to start over, and the beauty of the U.S. culture is that actually failure is considered a mark of education. Right. And so if I see someone, either they've been in the food service business, I'll have to hire them, but also if they had a startup, and you learn so much when you have a startup that fails. Well,
failure is definitely something that I've learned the most, from my career during those times, and having to pivot, embracing the process, knowing that failure might be coming down the road, but it's not an end. It's an opportunity, for a new beginning. So I think that's a really great message.
By the way, this applies to your personal life as well. Yeah. Because we're all people, ultimately, 24 hours a day. Right. And if you look back at your life and you say, that was a really horrible experience, but I learned so much. Because you don't say, oh, wow, that was successful. Look what I learned. You only think your breath isn't bad is good in the morning. Right. You just think you're great. So failure, and it's a comforting thought when you are going through a tough time. Well, at least I learned something.
Yeah. Looking out in 2025, what do you see as what companies need to do to pivot for 2025? Some general themes that you could share, with our audience who span from early stage food tech startups all the way to the Fortune 500 food manufacturing companies. Anything that you see as a leader in technology and innovation for 2025?
Well, certainly we're going to see growth in generative AI, and people should be looking at that and figuring out how it helps their businesses. I think also in the distribution area, self-driving is going to increase. Biden stopped it for 4 years. I'd be surprised if Trump didn't go back to what he did and Obama did. Again, I'm giving a U.S. perspective, but you can't ignore the results of the election. I mean, on the positive side for businesses, there'll be a lot less regulation, which is damaging and harmful. And I think it's, we've been run in Washington not by Biden, but by a lot of people who surround him who were Warren Sanders appointees. So he's a very, very extreme left. And it's death by 1,000 cuts for a lot of businesses. And clearly the stock market response is responding to the fact that businesses will do better.
Right.
On the other hand, we have to be realistic that based on what Trump has said, and he usually says what he's going to do and then does it, if we're facing import tariffs of 20%, that's going to be disruptive and inflationary and disrupt distribution. And for those that deal with China, if it's really going to be 60% tariffs, that will be devastating and inflationary as well. So there are, and his immigration policies will definitely affect agriculture. Now, I think what will happen with immigration is that he will focus on criminals first and then go to people who are freeloading off society. But I think the people are actually working and keeping things going. Maybe there'll be a way we can deal with that people, where there'll be paths to stay without necessarily citizenship. I don't know. And then there's the global situation. And I guess I have some optimism because his presidency for 4 years, we didn't have global problems. He had relationships with the worst foreign leaders in the world, but he had relationships that didn't do anything bad. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to resolve the Mideast crisis. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to figure out this thing with Ukraine and in Russia and Eastern Europe. And I'd love to see peace break out. I mean, who wouldn't at this point? We're just, as a world, this is not the right direction to go in. And I know it's difficult medicine because Trump is an unusual person. And we've never had a president like him, and it's scary. But on the other hand, I just think we have to adjust to change. We have to pivot as humans. We have a democracy. The people have spoken. The great news is that it was considered by all parties to be a fair election without outside interference, and we got to focus on what is keeping us together. And I think a lot of what keeps us together is innovation, and technology, and moving forward and solving fundamental human problems in healthcare and food and transportation. All these great things that technology is allowing us to do.
My last question, I can't end this conversation without asking you about CES 2025. As a huge fan of the show, having been there earlier this year, what can you tell us are some of the high points of what we should expect at the show in January?
Well, barring something unforeseen like a new virus, which you always wonder about when you've been burnt, is that we have an amazing show coming. I mean, if you look at our speakers, whether it's the head of NVIDIA or, I mean, there's so many. It's the CEO of Delta Airlines is using the Sphere to speak.
Wow.
And I'm so honored to introduce him. There's so many, like over 1,000 different speakers. But the technologies we're talking about, and with over 4,000 exhibitors and over 130,000 business attendees, and probably a lot of your listeners could be business attendees. It's an inspirational event. We do have a whole food section, food technology. There's a lot of, we're working with the United Nations to promote fundamental human securities, including the access to food, that no one in the world should be hungry, that no one should have be lacked access to health care or clean air or clean water. Technology is miraculous, and a lot of it, not all of it, there's a lot of other great trade shows and business events and company events, but this is where people are seeing it all in one spot, more than anywhere else. And it's just inspirational. It makes you feel good about the future of humanity. The technology and humanity will do well together. So that's what I want to see come out of it. And you'll see so many different solutions to so many problems. It's just exciting.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks again for spending time with the Food Institute. Love the book, Pivot or Die, and excited for CES 2025, and thanks for the transparency and honesty and sharing your insights.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be with you. You're such a major entrepreneur, innovator, and pivoter yourself.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.